Welcome to Introduction to Computer Science and Scratch Programming. This is Chapter 2, Part 3, Introduction to Computers and Computer Hardware. Our objectives for this lesson are to know the timeline for the microcomputer craze, including the introduction of the following players: Apple, Atari, Commodore, Tandy, and IBM, as well as to understand how the entry of IBM changed everything. After the introduction of the Atari 8800, Steve Wozniak, known as Woz, and his friend Steve Jobs' actions changed history. Steve Wozniak attended the first meeting of the Homebrew Computer Club in Palo Alto, California. It was held in a garage on March 5th, 1975. He left inspired to build a personal computer that could be owned by an individual. Woz soon presented his creation to the members of the Homebrew Computer Club. At that same meeting, Steve Jobs passed out schematics of their device. Jobs suggested that he and Woz develop and sell the etched circuit board for their device to members of the club for $40. These circuit boards would include no keyboard, no display, no input device, no power supply, and for that matter, absolutely no electronics. The image to the right shows such a board with chips, resistors, capacitors, and a processor already installed. This suggestion was received very well by club members. Jobs sold his VW bus and Woz sold his calculator. Yes, calculators cost in the neighborhood of $500 then. And the two founded Apple Computer. The first corporate headquarters would be in Steve Wozniak's mother's garage, shown to the right here. Jobs and Woz estimated they only needed to sell 50 units to break even. They quickly recuperated their costs and shortly after received an order from a wholesaler company for more than 100 completed computers at a price of $500 each. The two had 30 days to deliver on the order. However, in only 10 days, they delivered 100 computers similar to the one shown on the next page. The retail price for these first 100 computers was set at $666.66. That's the equivalent of around $2,800 today. Woz and Jobs could have stopped at this point and enjoyed their windfall, but they reinvested almost all of their profits into the company. They realized that a computer built in a wooden box may appeal to private individuals, but it was not something that the average business or school would proudly display in their office.
We're at the Living Computers Museum in Seattle, where they have a new exhibit on the history of Apple.
So the Apple I, obviously Apple's first product. The designation one comes from it being the first thing that Steve Wozniak designs before there is even an Apple computer.
So Woz's dad is an engineer, and so obviously kind of rubbed off on the kid, and he was very talented, obviously, because he managed to do something like this.
And he designs the Apple I to be kind of the computer he wants to have and to use. So it has a keyboard and it has a TV display that you can see what you're actually typing and doing on the screen, which was a new idea at the time. Nobody had really done that before, put a keyboard and a display on a personal computer. When they sold the Apple I, it was literally a board. You had to supply your own power supply, your own keyboard, your own monitor. So all you got was the board for $666.66.
The manual told you, go out and buy this set of transformers. This is the part numbers that are available. This is what they cost. And you went to Allied Electronics or somebody like that and ordered them at that point. Then you would get that stuff home, you wire it yourself, they show you where the wires go. They give you a connector, a mating connector that you put together, and then hopefully you power it up and things work.
So he designs it, starts giving away the schematics, and then Steve Jobs convinces him, well, we should sell this thing instead. Instead of just giving it away to the designs, let's sell it. So they form Apple Computer Company to do that, and they produce 200 of the Apple I boards. So a very limited run.
It's kind of like the Swiss Army knife. Once you invent it, basically you can use it everywhere. And they picked that because they could get hold of it. It was cheap, and obviously after 3 to 5 years, most people moved on from this machine because there was a better one out there. Apple came out with more products, everyone else came out with more products.
So they internally knew they wanted to sell a more mature product. So they started playing around with different designs. Steve Jobs really wanted a molded plastic case, but a molded plastic case is pretty expensive to make. So they started with sheet metal. So the one we have behind us is this two-tone sheet metal case that was custom made as a prototype to test things out. Once again, it's the only surviving prototype case that we know of. So in 1985, Apple's struggling a little bit. Steve Jobs had not done very well with the Lisa project, and then the Macs were not selling the way that Apple had hoped, so he quits in 1985. He leaves Apple, and when that happens, the HR department at Apple put the notice out saying, hey, anybody want to come take some stuff from Steve's office? Go ahead and do it. So sometime that afternoon, an engineer named Don Huntmacher goes into Steve's office, takes a bag of Starbucks coffee off the shelf and this kind of old beat-up metal-cased computer that was there. And he thought it was something kind of interesting. Nobody else had bothered to take it. So he took both those things home. The computer was left in his garage workshop for about 30 years. First clue, other than it coming from Steve's office that it was special, was it had a tag inside, handwritten tag, that says ACM Mod 1977 and signed BF. And if you do a little research, you find out Bill Fernandez is Apple's first employee. They were able to contact Bill, and he confirmed, yes, I wrote that note. So now you've got the first employee's name on it. You know it came from Steve Jobs' office. You know it was designed and built by Steve Wozniak. So it's starting to feel like a pretty important computer. So immediately after Steve Wozniak finishes the Apple I, he starts on the Apple II. So immediately starts designing what's really his dream computer, which is this all-in-one machine. So at this point, Mark Markkula comes onto the scene, who's their first VC. So he puts his own money into the company, and then he goes out to people like Arthur Rock to raise more money so they can actually make the Apple II. Well, to do that, you need a demonstration computer. And the machine behind us is what we think is the only surviving demonstration computer that was built. And what Steve Jobs did is he went to his longtime friend, Daniel Cockty, who was also an Apple employee, and he said, Daniel, hook this machine up so I can just plug it in and show them something. Because up to this point, you had to load all your software from an audio cassette drive that was very finicky, as we know from experience here at the museum trying to get it to work. So Daniel modifies it with a EEPROM loaded with Steve Wozniak's version of BASIC. So when you immediately boot it up, because all the other Apple ones, other than literally this one behind me, don't have that feature. Every other Apple I has no ROM. So as soon as you turn it off, everything's gone. You'd have to type it in from scratch.
Furthermore, with the success of the Atari and the recent success of the Apple I, many larger companies had noticed. Some of these companies were already working on similar products. Although Apple may have made it to the market first, if they were to survive and grow, they needed to address the cosmetics of the Apple I and work out a few bugs that existed in the original model. In June of 1977, Apple introduced the Apple II PC to the public. The basic system with only 4K of RAM hit the market at just under $1,300. This device, as shown to the right, included an optional Apple Monitor 2 that was not available for another 3 years. It's important to remember, if you wish to add 2 floppy drives and a display to your new Apple II computer, the price tag would quickly jump to around $2,800. That's the equivalent of around $12,000 today. After seeing the success of the Altair 8800, the Tandy Corporation of Fort Worth, Texas, spent only $150,000 on development costs and started working on a microcomputer. Tandy owned a chain of several thousand Radio Shack electronics stores throughout North America. Tandy had already introduced more than 2,000 products that were unique to their stores. The Radio Shack TRS-80 line of computers proved to be a success. The original TRS-80 computer was released on August 3, 1977 at a cost of only $399. This sub-$400 computer was easily hooked up to the family TV and could store data on a cassette tape using the optional adapter. This line of computers grew very quickly and soon included business PC with integrated display and disk drives, as well as a color computer 1 shown in the figure to the right. Radio Shack sold the TRS-80 in all of their stores. In addition, Radio Shack opened computer stores that carried only their computers while catering to small and medium-sized businesses as well as individuals. By 1990, Radio Shack was selling more than 2,000 computers a day. Then, the video arcade game manufacturers entered the home computer business. They already had some experience with graphics and building computer-related devices that ran their arcade games. Atari, a French-owned company considered to be the father of video game-based arcade games, was first. They hit it big in 1972 with the introduction of the game Pong. Pong was quickly followed by a slew of successful arcade games, including Atari Combat and Breakout. In 1975, Atari introduced a single game device that could be attached to the family TV and allow you to play Pong at home. These were marketed exclusively through Sears and Roebuck, marking Atari's entry into the consumer electronics market.
Hey, Clarence, what are you doing?
Playing a little handball. Now there's more to Sears Telegames than just Pong.
Hey, Gramps, you want to play some catch?
Okay.
Now Sears has a whole line of telegames.
Hi, Gramps, can I play?
Sure. Let's play Super Pong doubles.
And some telegames have remote controls, so up to 4 people can play a whole variety of games.
Hey, attaboy, Scooter, you got it, you got it.
Telegames, electronic games, sold only at Sears.
In 1977, Atari introduced the Atari 2600 gaming console, along with a library of 10 games that could be purchased separately as ROM-based plug-in cards. Atari had watched as Steve Jobs, a former employee, made it big in the microcomputer market, and in December of 1978, they introduced a home computer device. In November of 1979, Atari introduced the Atari 400, as shown to the picture on the right, and the Atari 800. These home computers retailed for $500 and $1,000 respectively.
Oh, come on. Oh, got it. Okay, everybody on YouTube, as you can see, I'm playing my Atari 400 in the background. Last week I mentioned it, and in this week, I'm just gonna be taking a look at this console and just kind of looking back on kind of an odder Atari console that many people don't know about. Hope you enjoy. In 1977, Atari Incorporated released the Atari 2600, a revolutionary home video game console that took the market by storm. Immediately, Atari began work on a new console. Early in development, it was clear that home computers were beginning to take off, with machines like the Apple II and TRS-80 seeing widespread success. And because of this, the CEO of Atari diverted the new game console to be a series of 8-bit computers to compete with Apple. The machines that would eventually be named Atari 400 and 800 were designed at two price points, the 800 being a more fully featured computer, and the 400 being more of a home console computer hybrid. The Atari 400 and 800 were released in late 1979, with the 400 going for $495, which was relatively inexpensive at the time. But because of tough competition and expensive build costs, Atari had lost $10 million on the systems by mid-1981. Though Atari found some limited success with its 8-bit computers and continued to build revisions until 1987, they never achieved mainstream success the way Apple or Tandy did. Atari eventually moved on to more traditional game consoles like the 5200, 7800, and Atari Jaguar. By 1981, the Atari 400 was retailing for just $329, which is when my dad bought the system. When I was looking through the box, I even found the original receipt. The total order of the system, with accessories and a few cartridges, was $533, which today would be about $1,400. So when my mom still talks about how expensive it was, I can understand why. But what I really want to know is, after 35 years, how does this thing hold up? As far as specs, the computer sports a MOS Technology 6502B processor, clocked at a blistering 1.79 MHz with 16 kilobytes of RAM, and is capable of rendering 384 pixels per television scan line. As awesome as that sounds, it was pretty common for the time. The Apple II, Commodore 64, and even the NES used variations of the 6502. So what really distinguished the system is the Antic Video Processing Unit. And though the Antic was advanced for the time, it quickly became obsolete when companies began using graphics chips that could operate independent from the CPU. Poor Atari, seems like in the 80s they could never catch a break. Hooking up an Atari 400 isn't as simple as just plugging it into your new flat screen. The console uses radio frequency video through an RCA cable, so though it looks like normal composite, it's not. What you'll need is either an RF box that came with this system or a little converter plug like this one I got off Amazon. From there you can plug it directly into an older TV, but if you have a newer TV it probably won't work. Using a VCR is the easiest way to hook this up to a modern TV. I got this Sony I'm using from the thrift store for $7. Plug the coax in, set your VCR to channel 3, and you should be good to go. The build of the console is solid but super heavy due to the RF shielding that was required by the FCC at the time. That was actually one of the main reasons the console was so expensive to build when it was launched. The Atari 400 has an old membrane style keyboard and it doesn't work very well. The keys aren't very responsive and typing is really slow, though I do like the porous texture of the keys and its retro brown and orange look. The video cable is hardwired to the system. The side of the unit has an expansion port, on-off switch, and the power adapter port. It also features 4-player controller ports on the front. It's crazy considering 4 players was a big feature of something like the N64, and Atari was doing that over 15 years earlier. On the top of the console you've got the logo and the cartridge port. The cartridges themselves are smaller than the 2600s, but have a similar locking system. Overall it's not a bad build, it's just a little bulky and obviously kind of cheap. The games I have for the system are Pac-Man, Space Invaders, Missile Command, and Computer Chess, so I'm a bit limited in my software library, and honestly the games are too expensive to buy just for this video. But 3 of these games are pretty iconic, so they do give a good impression of how the system runs. But before I talk about the games, I should mention Atari Basic. Now, Atari Basic isn't actually a game, it's just a cartridge of the Atari Basic computer language. If you wanted to write software or games, this was what you had to use for the Atari computer. A popular way of saving and loading software during this era were cassette tapes, and Atari designed its own player with a proprietary connector. Sadly, my cassette player doesn't work anymore, so I couldn't load up any of the cassette games I have. Floppy disk drives were released for the system, but were more popular with the higher-end Atari 800. Without a way to save anything, the basic interpreter is pretty useless, so I didn't mess around with it that much. I was pretty disappointed because I thought it'd be fun to write some simple programs on this thing. My dad did this a lot when he bought it, so I have several books on programming the Atari. Oh well, I guess I could use an emulator if I really wanted to. Also, something to know about this system is that the games are part of a separate 8-bit library, so the cartridges will only work on the Atari Computer series, and the computers are not cross-compatible with something like the 2600. Like the Atari 2600, the 400 uses the classic joystick and paddle controllers. Or you can use a Sega Genesis controller instead, which I would recommend as the joystick controllers don't work very well. For a system that's 35 years old, the games work surprisingly well. Pac-Man for the 400 reminds me of playing the arcade version. The music at the beginning is good and the controls are pretty responsive. Sometimes the game doesn't keep up with your inputs, but it's still a good port. Space Invaders is more difficult than other versions I've played, and when the aliens pick up the pace, they go really fast. I didn't do very well playing this game, but it's an older style that you have to practice. It always seemed like it came down to one invader, which was really difficult to shoot down. Still runs well and plays like an arcade classic. Computer chess is, well, computer chess. It runs okay, it's really slow, and because the system can only use one button, I got confused about what was going on at times, like which piece I had selected. Otherwise, it's just chess, so yeah. Missile Command was my favorite game out of the few I own, and actually it's just one of my favorite classic video games in general. This version has you protecting 6 cities while aliens attack you from above, and unlike some versions I've played, you actually can end up destroying your own cities, which I thought really added to the challenge. So with the Atari 400, you're really only getting a slight upgrade from the 2600. It wasn't until the mid-80s with the NES that games really started to change. Atari's one-button setup really forced games to be very basic, so you can only expect so much out of it. They run well and the graphics are serviceable, but this wasn't revolutionary. It was a small step along the way. There are a few titles that I want to get my hands on, like Donkey Kong and Asteroids, but overall this is a system from a different age, and sadly I don't see myself playing these games much. The Atari 400 is an odd piece of hardware and an interesting history of early home computers. It hasn't aged particularly well and is a bit of a hassle to hook up. The hardware itself doesn't sell for much on eBay, but the games sell for $8 or $9, making this relatively expensive to collect for, considering what you're getting back. If you want to collect for Atari, I'd suggest sticking to something like the 2600 or 7800. Someday I may try to expand my Atari computer collection, but until I have the extra cash, this will have to do. I've had a lot of fun reading about Atari history, and this console helped me get the extra stuff I need to set up consoles from that era. I hope you like this look at some classic video game hardware, and if I pick anything else up for the system, I'll be sure to post another video. Okay everybody, that was my video for this week. I hope you liked it. If you did, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, I think you know what to do. Leave me a comment in the comments section and hit that subscribe button if you want to see more videos like this one in the future. Coming up soon, I'm going to have another video. I'm not exactly sure what that's going to be. I might be doing one on the GameCube version of Twilight Princess. I got a copy of that from a person at work who really likes it. I didn't really like the Wii version when it came out 10 years ago, but I thought I might give it another shot. So that might be the next video, but could be something entirely different, not sure. But I hope you check it out. I'll see you then.
Commodore, the developer of the popular arcade game Asteroids, had already introduced a computer called the PET in 1977. They had decided to convert their gaming system into a usable computer and launched the Commodore 64 computer in the early 1980s.
To millions worldwide, the defining computer of the 1980s is the Commodore 64. Following up the success of the VIC-20, Commodore needed a new computer to set the benchmark of what 8-bit computing could achieve, in direct competition to the Atari 8-bit series home computers. Not only was the machine very technically capable, it was also a more affordable price point than other systems on the market. Initially, the 64 was marketed as a business computer, but due to the excellent sound capabilities of the SID chip and 64K memory, along with the great graphical options such as hardware sprites and bit mapping, the 64 was set to become the leading 8-bit games machine, often overtaking competitors such as the Atari and Sinclair machines. In many ways, the 64 was a reworked VIC-20. It used the same body style, but in a different color, used many of the same peripherals and cables, but the features of the 64 quickly made it obvious that this was a computer on an entirely different level than the VIC. This led to wide acceptance of the machine, and literally thousands upon thousands of software titles were developed for it and are actually still being developed. So that's enough history. Let's get to the good stuff. When you're looking to get a 64, you will no doubt see several different types. The first machine is commonly known as the breadbox or breadbin model. Earlier model breadboxes have these orange-yellow function keys as opposed to the later model, which has gray keys. A few years after the breadbox, Commodore started making the 64C, or cost-reduced version. It included a new version of the VIC-2 chip, but also a revision of the SID chip, which led to a slightly altered sound that not everybody likes. There's also a portable version of the 64, known as the SX64, which included a built-in screen and a disk drive. Also interesting is the Educator 64, which looked like a Commodore PET, basically, and was aimed at schools with its simple all-in-one design, not very common. Near the end of the 64's life came the C64 GS game system. It was essentially a 64 cost-reduced version with a new case and no keyboard. However, it's not fully compatible with all the software or games. The Commodore 128 is also worth noting real quick, as it has 128K of RAM and is basically the same, compatible with most of the software. I got my early model 64 for about $25, but it didn't work. So make sure that you get one from a reliable source and not some idiot on eBay who doesn't know what he's talking about. There's about a million things that can go wrong on a thing, and unless you have the proper hardware to test chips and fuses and find out exactly what's wrong, you're screwed. So, soon after, I got a gray-keyed breadbox version for about $50. I was willing to pay a little bit more to make sure it was clean and working. And also from another collector, and not just some moron who happened to find it in an attic, tried to make a quick dollar. You also need a 64 power brick. Most of the VIC-20s are not compatible. The 64 does have a built-in RF modulator, so you can connect it to a switch box or a phono converter and change the channel between 3 and 4. You can also use a composite connection, which I highly recommend, or a Commodore monitor cable if you have an appropriate monitor. Like the VIC-20, you can use pretty much any DB9 game controller, so Atari, joysticks and paddles, and Sega stuff is pretty much fair game. You can also use a mouse like the Commodore 1351, which is extremely useful for applications in some games. It's not really needed though. Software on the 64 is what's so great about it, really. There's no shortage of disc games, and although some discs are starting to go bad by now, most of them still work. Expect to pay about $5 to $10 for a good game with manuals and stuff, or you can do what I do and buy a whole bunch of discs for really cheap and see what you get. Of course, boxed games can go for considerably more. In the US, most games came on cartridges for the first year or so, and then pretty much everything was on 5 1/4-inch floppies. A lot of UK software, which had many of the better games, I would say, came on cassette, so having a data set to use would also be nice. The 1541 is the most common floppy drive. There are multiple variations of it. This is the one that I use. There's also the 1541 drive for the 128, which works fine, and the less common 1581, which use 3.5-inch floppies. You'll need to know the load commands to get the discs up and running. Just look online, you'll find them. They're not that hard to do. Put simply, the C64 is capable of so much it is insane. Remember, it was developed in 1982, so games like Turrican 2 and Nebulous are an absolute wonder to behold. Really don't even know where to start. There's just so many awesome games, so here's just a few of note. Of course, there's plenty of the expected arcade conversions. Most of the classics like Frogger and Miss Pac-Man are awesome. But of course, in the late 80s, as arcade games got better, the ports just get worse in comparison. So I would avoid those like Outrun and Street Fighter 2. They just don't look good and don't play that great either, for the most part. And what if you want to access all of these games but can't get a hold of the real discs? Well, you could emulate the machine, and there are many programs to do it, such as CCS64 and WinVice. Of course, that's not the only solution. The Commodore 64 basically got piracy started. Finding and downloading pirated games is pretty easy. They're all over the internet in different places. You can transfer disk images like these to a real floppy with devices such as the XA1541, which connects to a newer PC's parallel port. There's also other solutions for using flash drives and things like that with the machine. However, I do have to bring up a somewhat sad note. I live in America. Normally, that's not a huge problem, but with the C64, it completely sucks. American TVs use NTSC, and most of the best games that I listed earlier are in PAL format. So that presents a huge problem. Getting those games to work properly on an NTSC Commodore 64 is one of the biggest pains ever. It's my same huge complaint with the Amiga. I mean, the UK simply made the best games in the 80s, without a doubt, and it is an absolute shame most of them weren't available in the US. And if they were hard to find. Games like 1942 and Clax just don't work properly. They'll freeze, they'll play too fast, or sometimes they just don't even turn on. And almost all of the hacked games you can find to download online are not an NTSC version. So you really have to look for a good disk image if you want to try the transfer method. So this is why I end up not playing my actual C64 as much as I would like and end up just playing them on my Dreamcast or something, since I don't have a huge collection of real American discs. So, is the Commodore 64 worth buying? Why are you still watching this? Why are you listening to me? I think the games and the system's capabilities should speak for itself. Even if you're in America, the price really isn't that bad. You can usually find one, around $40 to $50 for a good tested one that comes with some accessories and maybe even some software. So for being the ultimate computer of the 80s overall, in my opinion, I say of course it's worth it. It's even more worth it if you're in the UK, which from what I've seen on eBay and some other places like that, you might be able to get it even cheaper. Plus you have tons of cassette games which go for basically nothing. I mean, less than £1 half the time, at least in my experience. So, yes, it's worth it. What kind of crazy question is that? It's the Commodore 64!
Both the Atari computers and the Commodore 64 computer were very attractive to the public because they offered a gaming device along with the opportunity for the family to own a home computer. In addition, because of their video game background, these computers offered graphics that were much more attractive than other devices on the market. By 1980, more than 1 million microcomputers had been sold, and personal ownership of computers had reached almost 3% of American households. Dozens of smaller companies had done well, and a few mid-sized companies had emerged with their unique computers. However, word had got out that things could change because IBM was working on a new personal computer. On August 12th of 1981, after a 12-month development cycle, a group of IBM engineers led by Don Estridge of the IBM Entry Systems Division in Boca Raton, Florida, released the IBM Personal Computer Model 5105. At that time, IBM was one of the world's largest companies with money to burn. IBM never did anything quickly, and they were known for having very long development and testing cycles. The fact that Big Blue had entered the market and did so as quickly as they did sent terror through the boardrooms of other computer manufacturers. The 5105 only had a 4.77 megahertz processor, 16 kilobytes of RAM, and no disk drives. In addition, it didn't come with a display. The price was initially set at only $1,565. IBM spent millions on an elaborate advertisement campaign and had already secretly started working on the IBM Personal Computer XT, shown to the right. That would be released only a year and a half later. It was clear that IBM hoisted the skull and crossbone flags and had Apple computers in their sights.
This is the original IBM Personal Computer Model 5150. This is actually the first revision of it, so-called Revision A, which dates from its introduction in 1981 until early 1982, when IBM made some updates and changes to the PC. The Revision A is notable because it only has up to 64 kilobytes of memory on the motherboard. And even if you use an expansion card to add additional memory, it can only support a maximum of 544 kilobytes of RAM, as opposed to 640 kilobytes of RAM that was the maximum for the later revision. It also has an earlier BIOS version, which does not directly support the use of hard drives or an EGA or VGA video card, because it can't initialize the BIOS used by those cards. So you can only support booting from a floppy. There were some aftermarket hard drives available for these early PCs, but they still required the use of a boot disk in order to load the driver for the hard drive. This one is equipped with 256K total memory using an expansion card, a monochrome text display and printer port adapter, and 2 double-sided floppy drives. The very first PCs only had single-sided floppy drives, but these are double-sided for a maximum capacity of 360 kilobytes on each disk. I have the original PC keyboard here, the nice clicky buckling spring keyboard. I do not have the original IBM monitor for it, and this is actually a color monitor, although it is a multi-system monitor which can support anything from the original MDA monochrome all the way up to Super VGA, and it even has a composite video input on the back. It's a Mitsubishi Diamond Scan 1381 monitor, so it is a color monitor, although this only has a monochrome display adapter installed. You can see on the back all the different input jacks and switches for the different modes this monitor can support. There's the BNC jack for composite, and a strange 25-pin input for color RGB, which of course requires a special cable, and a 9-pin connector for TTL, which is either CGA or monochrome. And the monitor itself was made in June 1988, so it's quite a bit newer than the computer itself. Of course, there's the cassette port, which the original PC had, and 5 slots instead of the later 8 slots that the PC XT had. Okay, let's fire it up. First turn on the monitor. Let it warm up for a couple seconds here, and then we'll flip the switch. which is over on the side here. This PC has an extremely quiet fan in its power supply. You can hardly hear it at all. That error is something to do with the memory, which I have to check out once I open the case. It's probably detecting a bad RAM chip somewhere. But it does boot into Cassette Basic there. It's its original version 1.00. The later PCs had version 1.1. This MDA uses a 50 Hz refresh rate, which is not agreeing with the camcorder too well, so you may see some flickering. There's also a little basic program you can type to display the BIOS state of the system. So I'll run it here. And this has the original 10/1981 BIOS. That's 1981, whereas the revision B has a BIOS date of 1982. I have this book here which originally came for Personal Computer XT, but it's close enough that the software that it came with will work just fine on the original PC. So let's pull out this disc here. Exploring the IBM Personal Computer version 1.00, copyright 1983 to 1984. Stick it in the drive there. And now I'll hit Control-Delete to boot it up. Starts loading from the floppy drive. And it goes through a whole series of lessons here about using the keyboard, using the disk drives, using DOS, and using BASIC. But there's one kind of fun thing in here is a imitation word processor called FunWriter, which I'll show you a little bit of later. One notable thing about the MDA text adapter is that it can support underlined text, which the CGA and EGA and even VGA display adapters could not do. You can see some more underlining there. And part of its lesson about the keyboard here. Here's FunWriter, the imitation word processor, and they can do some pretty interesting stuff, which I'll show you here. Here's the PC with the cover removed, and this lets you see some of the other things that distinguished early Revision A PC. Of course, it says right there 16 to 64K CPU, because this supports only a maximum of 64K on the motherboard. Another difference, especially on the very early ones, is that the Intel 8088 chip is dated only 1978. In 1981, Intel released a new revision of the chip which corrected some problems they had, and eventually those newer chips were, of course, included in PCs, but the very early PCs only had the 78 revision. And in fact, when you bought a math coprocessor, which would go in this socket, IBM gave you an updated 8088 chip to solve that problem. They said it was matched to the math coprocessor, but that wasn't really true. They just wanted to help get people to have the newer CPU chip to prevent any problems that might occur because of this older revision and some of the bugs it contained. But this one never had the math coprocessor installed, so it still has the older CPU chip in there. And you can also see that the backplates are painted black and they're wider. Now, when the PC XT was introduced in 1983, it had 8 slots, and the slots were also slightly narrower in width. So these wider covers and backplates would no longer fit. So IBM switched to slightly narrower silver backplates, but this is the older PC made before then, so it has the wider black ones. And also the power supply is the original black colored 65 watt version. I think in the later PCs, IBM used the same 130 watt silver colored power supply that the XT had. But this is the original, and I believe the power supply fan runs off the 120 volt AC line, which is another difference. These had a reputation for dying because it just didn't have enough power capacities to support upgrades such as a hard drive. I also noticed that the second floppy drive does not have the IBM logo on it, but if you look inside, it clearly has a sticker which says IBM Corporation. So it's definitely an IBM specification drive, it just doesn't have the logo on the front. This is the only part of the computer that is not an original IBM component. It is a quad RAM memory expansion board designed to expand the memory from the 64K that's on the motherboard to a total of 256K. And this is also the only repair I needed to do to the whole computer. It's this one chip here. You can see it's a different brand than the rest. The original chips on this board were all Texas Instruments, and I replaced it with this one here because this one chip was bad and it was causing a memory error when I turned on the computer. But with that one chip replaced, now everything works perfectly. And you can see this is also an early product designed before the XT came out, because it has that same wider black backplate on it. And it's just designed to go like that, right on top of one of the existing backplates. So there's the quad RAM board installed and ready to go. But before I put the cover back on, I'm going to do some preventative maintenance and clean the floppy drive heads, which is very easy to do on these old full height drives. You just remove these 2 Phillips screws, unplug these 2 connectors, and then the circuit board lifts up and out of the way, and you get full access to the drive heads to clean them. And also, while I'm at it, I'm going to lubricate the drive rails. And as proof that those 3 cards have been in the same position for a long time, they match up to the dust marks on the inside of the cover. On the back there are a few other differences which distinguished early Revision A PCs. The most notable being that the case is only held on by 2 screws at the bottom sides. The later Revision B PC, as well as the XT, had an additional 3 screws at the top, at the sides, and at the middle, which this one lacks. And I don't know if IBM ever officially called this the Revision A, but the later PCs with those updates had a letter B stamped in a circle on the back right about here. So people have taken to calling those the Revision B since they have the letter B stamped on them, and if that's B, then this must be A. This one happens to be serial number 262697. I have here DOS 2.1, which came with an amusingly cartoonish manual. Don't normally see these kind of cartoon characters in IBM manuals. And these discs have faded over the years. The labels, they weren't always this pink. So here we go with the power up. I have a backup copy of the PC-DOS 2.1 system disk. Put that in the A drive, and we flip the switch. The fan is very quiet on this PC. Just turn down the brightness a little bit for the camera. On the original PC, it does not display the memory count on the screen as it's testing the memory. So all you get is a blinking cursor as it checks the 256K of memory. Any moment now, there it goes. Starting up DOS. Asking for the date. Today is April 9th, 2012. Time is around 8:35 p.m. And there it is, PC-DOS 2.10. Just get a directory. And there you have it. We can run the original sample programs that came with the PC. And most of these will require the color graphics card, but there are a few we can run. For example, the music program. There's various little tunes they can play through the PC speaker. Rather primitive, but you have to remember this was a business computer, and back in 1981 most of those didn't even have any sound at all, just a little buzzer. So the ability to do even this kind of music was pretty good for the time. Okay, we can escape out of that. Now, even if only a monochrome text display, it is possible to run some games, especially those that were designed early in the life of the PC, when not everybody had a color monitor yet. This is a pretty good version of Pac-Man, all in text mode. Oops, got me. I was looking at the camera instead of at the screen. Now they're not chasing after me when I want them to. Okay, come here. Gotcha. This is actually a very good version of Pac-Man. Plays about as good as you could ever expect it to. And it was made in May 1982, around the same time as this computer was. Well, just as that was a clone of Pac-Man, this is a clone of Tetris called Niet. Oops, I wanted to get that one all the way over. Good, I got a tall one there. Those are always the best ones to get, those tall ones. I can even do that same trick where he displays the next piece. So, pretty good clone of Tetris. Pretty easy so far. Though I think I chose the lowest speed. So, once it gets going faster, of course, it'll get a lot more difficult. Now, this is where I start leaving gaps in the thing down there. Yep, so let's just end that. My name is IBM PC.
The generic term personal computer, or PC, was used long before the launch of the IBM 5150. However, because of its success and huge market share, the term PC quickly became synonymous with IBM, as they had substantially standardized a platform for personal computing. Many other companies saw the writing on the wall and had started to discount their computers or begin working on devices that were IBM compatible. Only Apple maintained a significant market share without becoming compatible with IBM standards. This concludes Chapter 1, Part 3, Introduction to Computers and Computer Hardware. In our next lesson, we're going to be discussing how Apple fights back. We're going to talk about the Clone Wars and the timeline of computer growth. And then finally, we're going to identify and discuss the internal parts of a microcomputer.